right. Ian, I think you are the first one on the agenda about the IP tables.
Sure. So there are some scenarios where IP tables backend detection can produce a incorrect result. It happens when a kernel can support NFT, but for some reason, maybe the primary CNI is using the legacy IP tables. And in this case, you don't really have any recourse because our detection method is not going to see any legacy rules in the pod's namespace. And then it's going to check if the NFT binary exists, which it will because we ship it in our image. And it will choose the NFT backend. So probably a two-pronged approach here. In the short term, I think it would be nice to introduce like a break glass way to influence how detection works. And then longer term, like probably 129, I think we need to look at improving the detection logic. So I guess the question here is, I think historically we have shied away from letting the user influence the backend detection at all. Do we still want to keep that as a hard and fast rule, or would it be okay to have some sort of like break glass API here that people can use like optionally? Stephen.
Ian, would that just look like you pass it a string of the IP tables binary you want to use?
I mean, it could. I think, you know, we could potentially also just have a like, you know, prefer legacy backend true or false, something like that.
Okay, makes sense.
It's really not yet at determining the shape of the API so much as like, I think we have shied away from this in the past. And do we still want to uphold that, or is this okay to look at some sort of API that will allow influencing it?
Could you remind me of the reason why we were shying away from it in the past?
I actually don't recall the exact reason. It may have just been a hard opinion of someone who's not very active in the project anymore. John, do you recall?
Can you describe the current behavior today? I remember there was some discussion around this, but I don't remember where we end up with the NFT binary. I remember maybe only not in the default image.
So the current behavior depends on where you're running it. We run the exact same logic when we're using the Istio CNI plugin binary installed on the host, and that runs based in the host's environment. So if you have a node that doesn't include IP tables NFT, then you won't select it. When we run in the CNI agent, we're running in our pod's environment, and we ship the IP tables NFT image with our, we ship the binary in our images.
Even with distroless image?
Yes.
Okay.
There was like a discussion around the native NFT stuff and whether or not we would ship it in there, which I think is not specifically related to this. Okay, it sounds like there's. Go ahead. Someone was about to speak.
Sorry, the Meet's not letting me raise my hand for some reason. I guess one quick clarifying question for me, as I'm trying to understand, is this just a versioning? Is this just a versioning issue since we moved out of the host netness and now we're in the pod netness, or is this a larger question?
I don't think I understand exactly the question.
But you mentioned that when we use, now that we're running in the pod netness, the Istio CNI net namespace, we have the binary installed. So in theory, we should be able to just provide the right experience out of the box. Is this only an issue for older versions where we're still running in the host netness?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So the issue is that our CNI plugin always runs on the host. Like it's a binary installed on the host that's called
Right.
Right? And
Got
so
it.
it just
Yeah.
runs in a different environment from our agent.
Got it. And that one always needs to have, and the one that runs in the host is always going to be platform dependent. So there is going to always be some checking.
Yep.
So the one on the host doesn't have the problem because we can detect it if the binary exists. Is the problem with the agent? I'm confused now.
The problem is that because they run in different environments and the check is just based around like, does this binary exist? They can come to a different conclusion on the same exact host.
Okay,
And
got
so-
it. So the agent doesn't have a problem because we always ship the binary. So we know what binary to use, but on the host, depends on what's there on the host. We're trying to figure out the right logic for the user.
I mean, realistically, the issue is that they can be mismatched. Like you can be configuring legacy rules on the host and then be configuring legacy rules in some pods and NFT rules in other pods if they get repaired. And so that's just like, it's chaotic and weird, and some folks have noticed it and don't like it.
But in that case, if they have legacy rule, wouldn't you want to use the legacy so that it would be backwards compatible so the older rule can still apply because it's their fault they didn't move to the new rule yet?
Yeah. So in the case of like repair, what we're going to do is we're going to go in there. We're going to check if there are legacy rules that exist in the pod. There aren't in many cases. That's why we're repairing it. Then we're going to say, okay, well, the binary's there, but there's no rules. So I'll check if there's an NFT binary. There'll always be an NFT binary. And so we'll always use that in that case. And now they're expecting legacy backend, but we're using the NFT backend instead.
So is this as simple as, well, let me not say that. Let me phrase it differently. Could if I understand the problem correctly, does the CNI, sorry, the daemon set that hosts the agent, if I understand the architecture correctly, that is what installs the CNI plugin, correct?
I
Yep.
think so, yeah.
So
Yeah.
in theory, okay, and that's why the ordering is off, because that daemon set is going to be looking at its own netness. Could we, in that daemon set, hop into the host netness? Well, no, we did that because we don't have downscope permissions. So I was thinking like maybe we could hop into the host netness, detect it, and then just tell the CNI like at install time. And in theory, that should be consistent. If I'm understanding the problem correctly.
Yeah, so I agree. Longer term, we should do something like that. We can either have like the repair just do delete behavior until it hears back from the actual plugin running on the node what backend to use. Like that would be a viable thing. We already have like a UDS connection between the two to share information. We could do something with like hop try to hop in onto the node somehow and detect it in a better way. There's like other options, but I think those are all going to be more invasive and something we probably don't want to just backport. So for existing users, that's not really a solution. Just wait till 129. So that's why I was thinking maybe 2 phases. Something minimally invasive that we would feel comfortable cherry picking to provide immediate backported relief.
That sounds reasonable to me. Thank you. That's you've explained this really, really well. I think, yeah, given everything, I think I agree with that.
So how far do we need to backport this to?
I think everything we support ships with this binary in it. I'd have to double check that when we added this, but basically, ideally, we would backport it to everything we still support.
Wait, Ian, can you? I still don't understand. I'm sorry. So there are 2 binaries: the agent, which runs in the pod, and then the plugin, which runs on the host. Can they both call IP tables?
Yep.
Okay. And maybe I just don't understand how it works. And then under which situations does which one call what?
There's actually 6 binaries. Sorry to make things more complicated.
Oh man.
There's 3 Istio Go binaries that invoke IP tables. There's the Istio init container. There's the CNI daemon set, and then there's a CNI plugin.
Yeah.
Those all run under different contexts.
Uh-huh.
Then in IP tables, there's 3 different binaries. There's IP tables legacy, IP tables NFT, and then IP tables, which is generally just a symlink to one of the other 2. So I guess technically there's probably 5 binaries.
Okay. 3 Istio binaries, 2.5 IP tables binaries.
Yeah, and then 3 different environments as well, which is where the IP tables binary would live, because they could live on the host, which is used by the CNI plugin. They could live in the CNI daemon sets Docker image, which is used for repair, or they could live in the IP tables init container one for normal init container stuff. Now, technically, the CNI one and the IP tables, or the init container one, it's very, very likely to have the same environment, unless you did something weird. But they're both built from the same base image. So.
And how does the conflict arise again?
The conflict arises because so there's 2 modes in which we can write IP tables, well, 3, into the pod, right? Let's ignore the CNI host one. Like the IP tables, the just normal init container one, we go and run in our container.
Yeah.
This detection logic, right? So we see probably what we see is IP tables NFT exists, so we use it. But in the repair mode, we're running in a different environment. And so we may have different binaries there, and we may invoke things differently. Actually, sorry, how it's most likely happening is not with the init container, but with the CNI mode, because you're not repairing the init container. In the CNI mode, it's run by the plugin, and so it's going to use the host ones. So let's say maybe their host doesn't have NFT, then we just use legacy. But then the repair mode comes in, it does have NFT because it's in our Docker image, which has whatever we put in there. So then it uses NFT. And then you end up with a case where, based on whether it was repaired or not, you use legacy or NFT.
And why can't we have it so that we always use the daemon set?
We could always use the daemon set if we did an approach like, instead of the plugin actually doing the work, the plugin is just a very dumb plugin that just calls up into the daemon set, and the daemon set does all the work.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually how the ambient mode works. There's pros and cons to that.
Okay,
That's
so
how it works today, but
and then there are 2 different contexts, which makes things even more confusing.
yeah.
So is that a problem only for sidecar? Oh, this problem applies to both sidecar and ambient.
No, this only applies to sidecars, because in ambient, we always are in the same environment when we set up the IP tables, which is the daemon sets environment, because the plugin just calls the daemon set, and the daemon set does all the processing, and there's no other path.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification.
All right. Well, it seems like there's not a lot of pushback on the general idea, so we'll try and work something up and let folks know. Thanks for the discussion.
Do you have any other topics? Or are we done with this topic?
I think we're done with this topic, unless other people have questions. And there was maybe one more added pretty late.
Yeah. This is somebody, I don't know if this person is on.
I am here. Hey,
Yeah,
everyone.
can you take us through this?
Yeah, so I'm part of the Spiffy community. I'm not sure if people have context on this. Spiffy is a standard that allows workloads to get a X509 certificate from a UDS socket. One of the common implementations is Spire, and Istio has this integration mode where during startup, if I think the component is called the agent, detects a Unix domain socket with this thing. It does not spin up its own signing, but it uses the Spire integration, or like it uses the Spiffy endpoint. This all works fine, but the situation is that in the ambient mode, it is not the actual workload that is entitled for the X509 certificate. It's the cTunnel as a trusted infrastructure component that gets all these certificates. And for this, our way to identify the workloads using peer creds and the process ID doesn't work anymore, because we would constantly identify cTunnel as the workload and not the actual workload cTunnel represents. As far as I know, Solo has an implementation for this using a custom API of Spire, which is not the Spiffy standard. And there were some previous work to actually standardize this API. Yeah, but for this, I wanted to know if there's any appetite in this. We actually bring this upstream into main Istio, I guess. Or if this work is not interested, because if it's just going to be like this, then we're probably not going to build this API into Spiffy, and we'll just have the Spire API support, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember we had a discussion, I think was Evan from your team. I forgot his last name. He come up and he presented this interest in working with Spire integration with ambient. And I do remember we had a discussion, and we would love to have this some API landed in Spiffy, so it does not just work with Spire, but it can work with anything that's implemented Spiffy. So, John, you may have more context than what I can remember.
No, I don't necessarily have more context, as my memory is terrible after taking the leave. But I just had a question. Why, as a user, like I'm not super familiar in this space, like, but why do I care if the API is in Spiffy or Spire? Like, pragmatically, isn't Spire the only, real implementation of Spiffy, or is that a naive take?
No, there's actually at least two other commercial providers that also implement Spiffy, but not the Spire APIs.
Like is Spiral, like, for example, and that's the only one I know. Is that
Yeah, that's the one I work for, and Teleport also has one.
Okay. the name Spiral and Spire are so similar. I thought it was more of a Spire offer rather than a spiffy offer. So,
and as far as I know, there's also work happening in Microsoft and Google to also have some support on this. And that
Yeah, I was gonna
again,
say-
easy. Yeah.
I was going to agree that yes, the cloud providers could implement, like if we were to implement something like that, we'd stick to the spiffy APIs versus being a Spire copy.
Exactly. Yeah.
One thought on this, while it would be great if this API were a part of the spiffy specification and available to all spiffy implementers, this issue has been kind of sitting idle for a long time, kind of waiting for that spiffy endpoint to exist. And Arndt, correct me if I'm wrong, I've not seen a lot of movement on getting that spiffy endpoint to exist. Should we just move forward with the Spire endpoint as is at this point?
So the reason this did not move was also because we were kind of waiting to hear if there's appetite from Solo to actually bring this implementation from cTunnel upstream, because this is right. And this was also Ben Leggett was in charge of this, and yeah, we actually had a long time struggling to find out who's going to pick this up. Yeah, so
I think we've since heard that the answer to that is no. Did I get that right?
Yeah, so basically Ben left the company and I believe he unassigned him to the task a long time ago. So I thought he communicated pretty clear that he's not going to work on that. Sorry if there's any miscommunication. I do remember, now that we just had this discussion, I do remember we reviewed this, I think it's the beginning of this year, where Evan come to the Istio community meeting, right? He said he's very interested to implement this. And then we discussed about why don't we have this API land in Spiffy so other people can benefit this who implements the Spiffy API, right? So, I know you have this API out. I'm curious, how far do you think it would get merged? So, because the concern I remember is if we do it with the ambient with spell, we would have to re-implement when this lands in Spiffy. Go ahead, John.
does someone have like the notes from that meeting?
Yeah, I was trying to pull out. I think
it's probably in the ambient working group.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to pull that up.
Yeah, so let's pull that out.
I will say,
Because that's not my memory of the meeting, but again, my memory is super fuzzy, so I wouldn't say.
Yeah,
I will say, Evan, I've been in talks with Evan this week, and he's no longer working on that.
Oh, okay. Is he still with the spell, the company that produced spell?
not in an active engagement anymore, no.
Oh, okay, got you.
But I'm picking up this work, and I was there involved as well. So yeah, like the question for us is now like we can wrap this up and bring it in, but it only makes sense for us as well if it's going to be a part of the open source, because we like if it's just going to be in Solo and I don't know, there's just one customer that uses Spire, then there's no point in doing all this work, right? But if there's a general appetite for it and it's going to become part of the open source one, then there's also appetite from us to actually include into Spiffy, because then of our customers may then also be interested in this, right? Yeah.
So I'll say, like, from my perspective, I would definitely like to see this land in upstream. I'm not at the point where I can commit to doing the work of getting it to land in upstream yet, although that could be something we discuss in terms of future planning. But certainly this has been something that has, been a part of kind of our roadmap, open issues plans for 2 or 3 years now. So it would be good to see that closed.
Okay, so I think I pull out the notes. We had the decision. Thank you, Jackie. Not sure if you're here. You've actually been keeping tracking notes really well. So we decided we want to see a design doc, which I don't remember we've ever seen a design doc, but I missed some of the meetings, so correct me if I'm wrong. So we want to revisit the Spiffy standards too. And so that's the decision. And I don't remember Evan or somebody else from Spell team actually come back to our work group meeting to present on this topic again.
Yeah, I think like ultimately the philosophy in Z-Tunnel, I was sending this issue that kind of runs it out, is that we want the smallest amount of broadest integration points, right? So like in the observability space for tracing, we don't actually implement tracing, but if we did, there's one clear winner there, OTLP. Universal standard supports every single tracing vendor essentially. In the CA space, it's less clear. There's less universal API, right? And so we don't want to add Spiffy, Spire, Google, Azure, 20 different CA providers. It's not tenable, right? We want to add a smaller point. And it was not necessarily clear that Spiffy or Spire was that universal API versus something else like the SDS one that was mentioned, or something that just maybe sticks files in the disk and Z-Tunnel can watch them, things like that. There was, I think, consensus in the doc there. It mentioned that if it was to be Spiffy Spire, like it would probably need to be Spiffy, so it's more generalized and not tied to just the specific Spire vendor API, but the more broader CNCF Spiffy. I think Spire is Spiffy or CNCF as well, but
Yeah, both are CNCF.
But I don't think that there was necessarily consensus that if there was a Spiffy standard, we would do it. That was more necessary but not sufficient. I want to keep in mind that I'm a Spiffy hater. Sorry, so I'm probably a bit more biased in the opposite direction. That I don't want to overly influence the direction based on my own personal opinions. But like that conversation really was never had about whether a Spiffy API was the right kind of universal API there.
I guess I'll be the anti-Spiffy hater, I guess, and say that in conversations I have with people internally and externally, whenever new things are being designed, Spiffy always comes up as both an encoding paradigm as well as the as well as the actual APIs for like requesting certs, because it's a thing that CNCF it's standard, it's there. So I guess if we were voting, my vote would be for including it. But I do share sort of the similar thing that John was saying earlier, that my preference would probably pretty strongly to support something that's in Spiffy versus Spire, so that we can, include the latter by having the former.
Mitch, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I did just want to point out that secure workload authentication is part of the new outcoming Kubernetes AI conformance. And it calls out two technologies in particular, workload identity and Spiffy or Spire. I think it would behoove us to integrate with at least one, if not both of those, so that Istio continues to be an integral part of secure or of the AI conformance story.
Keith, not Keith, Mitch. One thing I want to point out is that being able to issue workload identities and Spiffy identities is not the same as integrating with Spiffy or Spire's gRPC APIs. In fact, today with sidecars, when you use Spire with Istio sidecars, we do not implement any of these APIs inside of Istio itself. Spire itself, I think is how it works, has the shim that translates Spire into Istio's own natural certificate issuance flows, right? So this would be the only time that Istio has had a direct, I don't know what's the word, dependency on these APIs, as far as I know. Obviously, there's a hand, so go ahead.
Is there a reason we can't just do that in ambient as well? The sort of shimming Spire and Spiffy into the natural
That's exactly what this SDS comment from Costin is about.
Okay.
That's the detail of how Costin thinks it should be implemented. I don't necessarily know if that's the right way to do it, but
yeah, the tricky part with Z-Tunnel is that you're not asking for your own, you're not asking for your own identity. That is where just that little bit of extra complexity is why there's talk of what API to use, because that is a somewhat novel thing, this sort of delegated identity thing, and that is not clear or as standard about how to do that. There's not a lot of prior art there.
Yeah. On it.
Yeah. So what currently happens is that actually on that UDS gRPC server, there's also the Envoy SDS API running, and that is the one that Istio agent connects to, right? So it is the SPIFFE socket, but it is the Envoy SDS API. My understanding of this API is that it generally, I think it's like this notion of resources and so on that go back and forth a couple of times, that it potentially supports this. But I've always found this API super confusing and not intuitive. So I'm not in no way in any position to say that whether this is fit for it or not, or can provide any sort of standard or design on it. So if we were to decide SDS is the way to go, we're happy to implement it, but we cannot take a leading part of it from a SPIFFE perspective, right? Because it's just not our API and not our domain in this regard. What I still think is going to be important that the UDS is a different one, because that API is going to be critical and has a different trust relationship than the API the workload uses. Right, so we also believe that the socket needs to be placed in a different path, and there needs to be access control just to the socket itself, just to prevent workloads, normal, ordinary workloads, from reaching that API and impersonating others. Kind of, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, at a fundamental level, there needs to be something that validates that ztunnel has the permission, has the right to request the identity that it's requesting. What that contract is the question. And to be honest, I don't even know that XDS, maybe I'm misunderstanding something or don't know enough about XDS, it's totally possible. But I don't know that XDS is even expressive enough for that at this point.
Maybe on this regard, the current API, the way it works is that ztunnel gives to Spire the process ID, and Spire is then doing all the attestation identification and returns the certs. My understanding is that XDS has this notion of giving some identifier and getting back certificates and also requesting multiple. Yeah, but I just think that like Istio and this community here needs to decide which way they want to go. And based on that, we can then discuss the actual details. And if you guys decide SPIFFE is the way to go, we're very happy to standardize an API for it. If it's SDS and so on, then we need to discuss who's going to take the lead on it.
Would SDS be compatible with our model of delegation, where the utility requesting the certificate is not the pod itself?
I believe it is, because it allows for request data to be, like, I think it's resource names or something. I need to revisit this, but I believe there is a way to basically indicate what workload it would represent, like basically pass in the process IDs.
Yeah, my understanding is in the sidecar flow, we just request default, and then Spire knows that we are foo, so we should get foo certificate. In the ztunnel flow, in the SPIFFE APIs, you send a request that says, I need this process ID certificate. And then it goes and looks up, okay, this process ID is in this container, this container is this pod is this identity, so we'll give you that certificate. So in theory, I don't see why you couldn't send a request over SDS that says, give me process ID 5's certificate. Maybe a bit more clunky, potentially. Not necessarily, I don't see anything fundamentally breaking it though. I do think if the flow is like one thing we mentioned, just like, oh, like, can they just stick a folder of all the certs in somewhere and we watch them, for example? If the SPIFFE model requires to get the PID to know which certs it should even use, then that model probably wouldn't work. if there was some other mechanism that didn't require a per certificate input, then that model potentially could work. Like just even ignoring SPIFFE, Spire, anything, like one could hypothetically design a daemon set that looks at all the pods on the node, provisions a cert for each of them, and writes them into a file, right? And then we come up with a naming scheme of, this file format is meant for this identity or whatever, and do that. There's plenty of reasons why that might be a terrible idea, just spitballing hypothetical ideas of integration points.
The two main concerns we're having in SPIFFE with files is that we lose control over it, right? And the access control is basically just then the access control of the file. And the second thing is that having the UDS allows SPIFFE to push down updates either to the certificate of the workload itself or the root. And with this stuff like one-click rotation, immediate key rotation and stuff is happening, right? So every time there's an emergency rotation, we would actually push down your certificate and your roots actively to all the workloads. And if it would be on a file, then you would need to watch on the file and so on. Like it just gets more complicated, and there the UDS is just very convenient.
Yeah, I agree that there are a lot of issues with files. We would definitely have a file watcher if we were to do it. But I think also people don't necessarily like their PKI to live in files for good reasons. So
I guess to recap, it sounds like we're at a decision point. We can either collaborate with the SPIFFE community to come up with a standard API, or to enhance an existing API to define that contract for delegated identity requesting. The other option, if Istio wanted to just use XDS, someone from the Istio community would need to do the work on the SPIFFE/Spire side. Well, it wouldn't be SPIFFE, would be, I guess, the Spire side. Well, I guess it could be SPIFFE, okay, but anyway, to essentially read the XDS for the process ID and sort of do what John's, I think that at a high level, I think that flow would work. But that's where the decision point is, if I'm understanding correctly. Does that match everybody else's understanding of where we go from here?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the decision we wrote in January, it seems we're still at the same point where we last met on this topic, right? Where we said we have to explore SDS design or revisit SPIFFE standards, or explore both options and figure out which option is the best for the community.
So to that end, would it be possible to get a design for the delegation API integration on your end?
We have a working brokers in that. That is the one PR that has been shown here before. I can put it into the docs.
Is that the PR that's been stored? This one?
Yes.
Let's put it in here.
Yeah.
I'm less thinking of like a pull request and more of, because we're not SPIFFE engineers, I'll say I think we're probably much less familiar with how SPIFFE works and what it does than you are. So a design would explain like the value of using the delegation API rather than how the delegation API is implemented, etc.
Yeah, there's also the stock here that is being shared. Yeah. We can go through. We can go through it again next week if that helps, right? And people can read this. Yeah, but yeah.
So what's your take on this PR, given it's been out for so long and has emerged? What are the concerns? Sorry, we haven't read everything yet, and we're not the expert in this domain either.
So my understanding was from back then that Solo and us have a common customer, and this kind of initiated this whole work.
Is that true? I actually didn't know that.
That is like, I don't know, that like Evan was part of all these conversations and so on. I'm just taking over here in some ways. But I don't think this is the case, the up-to-date case anymore. I don't know if the customer is migrating to ambient mode or has found a different way. I don't know that.
Okay.
The thing this one didn't progress is also because the reason was we didn't know if there's any appetite in actually implementing this, right? And we don't want to add something to a standard knowing that our the main client for it is not going to implement it, right? So again, if we are either going to close this PR now or we're going to proceed with it, but that's the reason I'm here, right? To kind of get closure on it.
So if the Istio community said that the Spiffy API for delegation was the way forward for ambient, you would merge this PR, and then do we know who would work on implementing that on the Istio side?
I can only speak for the Spiffy side, and that would at least be Spire and us as well.
Okay. Because that's the key thing. Like, there's sort of a twofold problem. There's what does the project think should happen technically? What is the best solution? And that's a good discussion to have. But there's also, even if we identify the ideal solution, if we don't have anyone willing to do the work of implementation, it's sort of a null point, right?
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm not in a position to volunteer to do the work. And I'm not hearing from anyone else yet. Any others? Anyone here from, like, say, Red Hat or? Looks like Salesforce is also not here.
I mean, I guess my other question is, if we did have somebody, and I don't feel the willingness to implement it on the Istio side is the question here. I think the main open question is what John was saying earlier, which was we're not even sure. We don't even have consensus that Spiffy, if the Spiffy API was implemented, that we'd want it in Istio. So I don't know that it's really a question. It's not a question of who's doing the work. It's the should we do the work part.
Yeah. I agree. It's like, is this what we want to do as a project, which we don't know, because we said last time there are two options, and we have resources to explore potentially one option. That's the challenging.
So again, my position is I feel like Spiffy is a sufficient enough standard for this. And to be honest, it's the only standard that I know of for delegated act. Like, this would be the only, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this would be the only API of its kind for the sort of delegated identity stuff outside of the existing Spire one. I don't think anything else describes what zTunnel is doing in a standard way outside of Spiffy. So that biases me towards supporting a Spire implementation. A Spiffy implementation of this new workload API, just because there's no other one that exists. Are there any other thoughts on why we wouldn't support this API?
So I guess this is a question about the Spiffy API. Is it also like Kubernetes Gateway API, where you go through the phases of experimental, alpha, like that too?
We don't have things like that in place at the moment.
So if we merge, it would be landing the next release and be the same stability level as the rest of the API, kind of right now?
It's a standard, right? So it's going to be up to the implementation to decide what's their sort of SLA on it, right? And their sort of stability on it.
Okay.
In Spire, it would certainly first be on an experimental or preview thing before they would actually fully support it. For us, it's going to be probably a bit different. Yeah, that's implementation specific. There's one more thing I actually wanted to add. We've identified a couple of other use cases for this API, where in general, and I described this in the doc, it's in general trusted infrastructure components that act on behalf of the workloads you represent, right? So this is Istio, for example, but there's other use cases where that applies as well. So we may reuse this API for other purposes as well. Yeah, but I don't want that. Like, there's also no concrete plans for anything of this kind. So this just more like a soft factor maybe. But
Yeah, so I guess in the absence of any other standard, my question is why. I guess my question would be why. What about this API? Because this would be the only spiffy API that Istio would have to implement. We wouldn't have to implement the other variety of APIs. It would just be this one that's sort of purpose built for the zTunnel use case. So my understanding would be any issues with spiffy APIs would need to just be is mitigated by that. We're just binding ourselves to this one API. We can ship it as alpha, and if nobody uses it, we can always or if we have negative feedback, we can submit feedback to the API. We can iterate. It's just like Gateway API or anything else that Istio integrates with from a standards perspective. We've got flexibility to shape it, to provide feedback, to put it at whatever feature stability stage that we think that we think is appropriate. So again, I have no issues with theoretically implementing this API. Who implements it's a future question. Are there any other? I think I would like to have, because we're running out of time, I'd like to see have clear next steps here. And so, are there any other concerns with implementing this API? Can we get to that decision point in the next 6 minutes, or do we need some more discussion to figure out if we would be if we'd be okay with implementing the spiffy API? Because that seems like the next decision point to me.
So if I understood correctly, if we decide to go to the spiffy route, we need this API to be merged, assuming it fits our purpose. And secondly, we also need somebody, I don't know if Alit, you said you would be willing to do that, actually implement this API in zTunnel, so zTunnel can do this on behalf of Hussein to get the right identity from whichever implementer you support. Probably we start with Spell, which is where your team come from, and then we would also provide the example as the Spell code for somebody else to implement, other spiffy implementer to implement if they choose to. Is that the right thinking of what needs to be done? I'm just thinking loud here. If we're not exploring the SDS path. Okay, I do think maybe we need to understand a little bit more. I would love to see a design doc on how this could ties together, because right now I don't think we had enough time on this API and also on what needs to be done in zTunnel.
I don't think the zTunnel question is necessarily relevant right now, just because the question that was posed earlier is, if the standard exists, would we implement it? And I think that's the more critical question right now. Like, if the standard exists, if it's perfect, if it's the best specification that can be written for spiffy, would Istio want to implement it? I want to see if we can't get a clear answer on that question.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And like you said, Keith, I don't see other options here realistically. We don't want to get into the business of defining our own security standards in competition with spiffy. It's already pretty widely adopted. So I would just look at taking on what they are advocating as the best solution in the class. And what Solo has advocated as the best solution in the class too.
Okay, can we stop bringing up commercial decisions which have no correlation to open source? That's what we have done in our commercial product has no bearing on our endorsement of good solutions or what open source should or should not do.
Actually, I'm referring to blog posts that I don't think reference any commercial products.
I would put marketing in that same category. you might find. Well, I shouldn't say it's not recorded. I'll DM you something.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. Let's put this on the agenda next week. Give everybody some time to think about it, read the docs, get
Yeah.
content.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you so much on it.
Thank you all.
Guys, appreciate you showing up for our meeting. I always love having folks from other communities come and share the latest in the standards, and really appreciate your time.
Glad to hear. There's also a Spiffy meeting if anyone wants to join.
Yeah, I might pop my face in now and again when to discuss. Seemed interesting.
All right.
All
Talk
right.
to you next week, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.